So let's get started now. We have today a very special guest. He's an expert, a player in the thought leadership space. He's also a partner. He's part of our advisory board in the Strategy Implementation Institute. Tony is somebody I admire. He's always a bit ahead of the curve in terms of thinking or bringing back the thinking to the things that matter. So I was very happy when he accepted to join us today. He's working on a book and on his principles about people and people-centric transformation. I think this is something that I want to hear more. He has been a speaker in Brightland, Richard, of course, in the Peter Drucker Forum. Duke, he comes from some years in Singapore, so he has as well some perspective maybe to share on what's happening there. He's been entrepreneur developing Duke in Asia. So there's so many topics that I want to ask and share, and also leave a lot of time for you to make questions and learn from Tony. So Tony, thank you so much for here being with us in this group of volunteers. You know how we're just trying to find ways to help people, learn from people like you, but also have some impact. And we call ourselves Global Initiative for Positive Impact. So we hope we can have an interesting talk. I'm sure we'll learn from you. And here we are. Tony, the floor is yours. You want to share some slides? You want to talk? It's whatever you prefer.
Yeah, if I could share some slides, that's fine. I had a moment of inspiration this morning at 4, so I threw together some charts. They're not really perfectly perfected, but that's okay, because perfection is the enemy of the good, Antonio.
Yeah.
You want to throw the power my way, maybe?
I'll throw you the power. The only thing, Tony, if you don't mind watching out once in a while, if there are people to join. I think when I give you the power, I cannot accept some people that join later. So if you don't mind watching that, just accept them.
I think if you do under share screen, give everybody share. You keep the power. I just have the presentation, maybe, Antonio.
Share screen, multiple participants can share. Wow, I learned something new. Thank you, Tony.
This is what happens when you have to when you work at a university and you've got to get 6,000 courses online very quickly. So
okay.
Let me see here. Just make sure that you can see my screen.
We can see your screen.
Okay. So Antonio, thanks so much for the invite. It's good to see so many faces. Mark Prinsky, I've known for quite some time. We were quite involved in game-based learning, and I also saw that book that you produced, which was fantastic. I've also had the great pleasure of looking in on a number of the folks you've had, Rita and Marshall Goldsmith and Alex and others. So I thought what I'd do is pull together a couple of different things, a couple of different threads based on my experience living in this basement for the last 3 months. And part of it is learning how to kind of use this medium to make sense of things. So I'm going to share some of that. Secondly is I had to do quite a deep dive into COVID and try to understand some of the complexities of it. So I'd like to share a little bit about that. But then, Antonio, I'd like to bring it back to the notion of project. And those of us who are project professionals, you know, what can we do more, better, or differently, given what we know how to do in this uncertain time? So that's roughly my agenda. Does that sound okay?
Excellent, Tony. We just need maybe half an hour for Q&A. There's quite some questions all the time. So if you can squeeze your slides, we have a bit of breaks. We'll see how it goes. But go ahead, Tony. It sounds good. And I love that you connect to the project world.
Yes. So what I'd like to do, let me just make sure I have chat up so I can track that. Just 1 second here. Chat, here's chat. Okay. Great. That way I can monitor chat, because that's part of what I learned actually in having to convert my courses over. The first thing I'd like to talk about is a little bit about what I've learned on the power of insight. And then the second thing I'd like to do is kind of talk a little bit about navigating the COVID-19 chasm. So the first thing here is about the power of insight, and I'm going to open it with a quiz. So, you know, you have to open every presentation with a quiz. That'll get people engaged. And so my question is, who is this man? Anyone, can you type in, who is this man?
Oof, that's a tough question.
Anyone? Sully. Thomas got it right. That is Sully. Sully was the pilot on flight 1549, 155 people on board. When Sully was getting ready to take off on that plane that morning from LaGuardia, his only question was whether or not he would make the connection in Charlotte to get home in time to eat dinner with his wife. At about 2,800 feet up in the air after 2 bird strikes and recognizing that he had lost all power, that was no longer his question. His world had moved from being, you know, a relatively simple world where he was actually the co-pilot to a very complex one where he found himself in a machine that was disabled 2,800 feet above one of the most populous areas in the world. And he had to go through a process of figuring out how to solve a very complex problem that had just been presented to him in the blink of an eye. And I've written a number of cases on this, but one of the things that Sully suggests was that he had a hobby, he had a pastime and prior experience that he believes probably helped save the 155 people on this plane, if not many of the people on the ground in New York had he not landed the plane in the Hudson. So my second question to you is, what hobby or past experience is it that Sully had that he was able to draw upon in this complex situation to allow him to successfully save the 155 souls on board and not damage anybody, any human beings on the ground? Of course, the plane took a hit. Anyone know what his hobby was? Or experience or prior habit? No? Tomas? Meditation? No. Meditation does come up a lot. Mark Prensky, I would expect to say flight simulators. A lot of my students say gamer. He was a gamer, he was a flight simulator. Sully was a glider pilot. He had learned how to glide when he was with the military, and he used to do it as a pastime. And what he realized when he was 2,800 feet above the air is he had a moment of insight. He had this aha moment. He had this insight come to him where he said, I am no longer flying a commercially powered aircraft. I'm flying a 70-ton machine with little itty-bitty wings. So when he describes how he was dealing with this complex situation, on the one hand, he was leaning into all the standard operating procedures, dump the fuel and test the engines and try and restart the engines and so on and so forth. And he offloaded that to his co-pilot. And on the other side, he was thinking about and reframing his situation as a glider pilot to try to say, okay, if I have to get this plane down, I have to look at multiple progression paths. Can I get it back to LaGuardia? Should I go for Stuart Newberg? And he went through multiple progression paths, always thinking about this is a glider with little itty bitty wings. And what I have to do is keep the nose of the plane flat so that I can maintain forward progression as far as I can possibly go. And he went through 3 or 4 possible progression paths until he finally concluded that the best possible future, the best possible alternative was for him to land in the Hudson. And because he had taken that prior experience and that moment of insight, he was able to clear the George Washington Bridge by no more than 900 feet in landing that plane. So why am I telling you this story? Well, I'm telling you this story because I believe that there's a lot of power in insight. And when I work with my students these days, particularly seeing as we're working at a distance in forums like this, what I suggest to them, borrowing heavily from Peter Senge, is on the right-hand page when you're taking notes are data, facts, figures, tables, graphs. Everything you see here I will share with Antonio so you can pass it along to the group. So it's not that matters. What really matters is the left-hand page or the left-hand column. And when you're taking notes is, what are you thinking when you're hearing this, right? What is your little voice saying to you? What is your intuition saying to you? And I think there's 3 things, there's 3 ways it manifests itself. The first way is, whoa. Whoa, I didn't know that. Whoa, I don't believe it. What that does is it jars your assumptions and catches your attention and maybe surfaces something from your unconscious that you're not even aware of, but that it gives you pause in a positive or negative direction. So that's the first one. The second is an aha. After a whoa, you have an aha. It's some kind of insight, just like Sully did around gliding. I'm in a glider. And the third one is, if you truly do have an aha that kind of surfaces some of the underlying assumptions that you have, it inevitably leads to a question, because you're kind of pushing the envelope of your assumption base, and so that will lead to a question. So essentially, what I really recommend for my students, and also perhaps for our time here today, is that we be a little more prescriptive in using the back channel to do what I call whoa, aha, and hmm. And this is what it looks like. I do this all of the time when I run sessions physically. This is actually some pictures. So as I'm speaking, I'm going to speak very fast on purpose. And what I'm trying to do is surface whoa, aha, or hmm from you. Okay. And then I'm going to ask Antonio. We haven't planned this, Antonio, but
no.
I know you'll go with me on this. I'll just show you. This is an outcome from my class. What happens is, if you have a whoa, you put an asterisk in front of it. If you have an aha, you put an exclamation mark in front of it. Or if you have a hmm, you put a question in front of it. So the idea here is, we want to very deliberately use the back channel in Zoom to kind of surface our whoas, aha, and hmm as a group. And if I'm right, and this has been my experience in prior sessions, we'll then be able to mine that in the second half of our conversation about any assumptions we want to test, any questions we have, and more importantly, any insights we've generated about what I'm about to speak about. So my plea and ask of you is, would you be willing to do that? And if so, can we try and test it right now? If there was a whoa, please put an asterisk with the whoa. I didn't know a plane was 70,000 tons or whatever it is. If there was an aha, you know, you have to think differently or reframe a problem. Or if there's a hmm, question mark, please go ahead and type in. There you go, asterisks. So if you have a whoa, do asterisks with your whoa. No, actually, so Shrikant, if you have one, what I'm looking for here is exclamation mark, I'm in a glider. Asterisks, I have pause. Question mark, I have a question. Let's see if we can try that one more time. Did anything about what I just told you about that story give you a whoa, an aha, or a question, or a hmm? Anyone in the group? The machines are gone, right, Tomas? For those of you who are, there we go. How can we get that insight moment? Perfect, that's a question. I have a relevant prior experience. Perfect. Now we're working. Thank you for indulging me. So Antonio, that's the idea, is that we want to be deliberate in using the back channel, and we want to use the code of an asterisk, a question mark, or an exclamation mark, so that as we're parsing what's going on in chat, we can get a sense. Sometimes my students are very innovative. If somebody asks a question that others want answered, they'll use a caret and they'll point up to say, let's answer that question. So then you have the group kind of thinking about a general consensus of what we would like to ask. Okay, so we're good on whoa, aha, hmm. And I'm now going to move forward and talk a little bit about COVID, okay? Navigating the COVID-19 chasm. I have a pop quiz for you here, and I want to talk to you a little bit about physics. Are there any physics major in the group? Any physics people with physics background? For those of you who don't have physics, you're going to have to go really far back, probably to your high school years. But if I think about distance, the distance from A to B, in projects, a lot of times we have to get from A to B. And I think about the first derivative of distance over time, that is called velocity. Sometimes it's called speed, but that's not actually accurate, because velocity also has direction to it. The second derivative of distance, or the first derivative of velocity, is called acceleration. So that's velocity over time, or distance over time squared. Here's the pop quiz. Are you ready? What is the third derivative of distance, or the second derivative of velocity, or the first derivative of acceleration? What is that called? Now, many of you might want to Google, which is fine. But anybody have any in text? Anyone know what it's called?
Good question.
Anyone? Or you can shout it out. Momentum's close, James. Close, but no cigar. Rate of change, close, Corinne, but no cigar. Inertia, close, Pierre. This is good. We're getting some movement here on the chat. Any others? Well, it's called jerk. It's called jerk. And if you're in the United States, it's called jerk. If you're in Europe, it's called jolt. And it is the third derivative. And what I'd submit to you is that today, the rate of change is jerking us around. In fact, we humans are not really well instrumented to deal with the third degree rate of change. Most of us have experienced velocity. Most of us have experienced acceleration. Unless any of us have been on one of Elon Musk's rockets lately, we haven't experienced jerk in the space context. However, I do think that what we're dealing with here is not just that things are speeding up, but that the rate of change itself is changing. So it's not a linear thing, it's an exponential thing, because we're actually going through the first, second, and third derivative rate of change, right? And I think, you know, the human system has some difficulty in dealing with the rate of change. Sometimes I kind of say that the pace of technology is jerking humanity around, and we have a real hard time kind of managing all of that. Just how many emails you have to field in a day is one visceral kind of perception of what we have to deal with here. My next pop quiz is, if we start to look at diffusion of technologies, this is work I did way back in 2004 when I was at IBM. And what we did here was we mapped particular technologies over time. So Richard Straub might remember some of this from the GIO, Global Innovation Outlook. So here we're saying it took about 115 years for an automobile. It took about 65 years for an automobile, 110 years for an automobile to get to 65% penetration. It took 120 years for the telephone to get to 80% penetration. It took 70 years for the TV to get to penetration. Now this is in 2004. There's 4 patterns that we see in the diffusion of innovation that I'd like to call out for you. The first is SCurve. So what we typically see, if we just looked at all of those and we regress them out for world wars and stuff, is that most diffusions have an SCurve. The more we go from atoms, automobiles, to bits, cellular, we see an acceleration. So the curve, the steepness of that S-curve and the speed with which that S-curve is adopted is going up. The third is the VCR. So my first question that I have to ask my MBA students these days is, do you know what a VCR is? I don't think I have this problem with this group. My second question to people of this group is, did you ever figure out how to program the clock? Or did it always flash 12? Because my VCR always flashed 12. I could never figure out how to do it. But here with the VCR, what we see is it's truncated. It's stopped. And why did it stop? Well, it stopped because something else came along and disrupted it. That would have been the DVD at that point in time. DVD players were better. You could fast forward through them. They didn't melt. They got to the same price point, so the market moved on. And then the last one is one that I think we really need to think about today in the context of COVID, is convergence. So if you looked at cellular and you looked at PC and you looked at internet and you just ran those trajectories forward, remember this is 2004, you'd have a point of convergence, and that point of convergence essentially ultimately led to the iPad, all right? Where someone like a Steve Jobs, who's kind of a visionary, can see a convergence of these particular trajectories that creates an opportunity for a new platform. So why am I telling you this? Well, I think that today, because of COVID and technology and everything else, we've reached what I'm calling a permaflux threshold. The rate of change is moving along pretty fast, and the waves. I know that Rita taught you a whole lot about waves and inflection points when she spoke to the group. Very much in agreement with her perspective. But what's happening now is multiple waves are coming up and washing up on the shore faster than we can perhaps even surf them. And so there's a point at which I'm calling it a permaflux, where the waves are just kind of undulating and moving and creating first and second and third order effects. And the question is, how do we manage our way out of that? How do we lead our way out of that? So what I'd like to do is give you a little bit of context for what this might mean and how we're dealing with the permaflux threshold from a COVID perspective. From a COVID perspective, and I'll send you this document if you want, but with my class, I actually developed a kind of a simulation for my students who in global markets and institutions to kind of look at how do we deal with COVID. At the time, it was not really well known, but we were talking about, how do we flatten the curve, number one? How do we raise the line? Number 2, which is how do we have more capability? And then once the line is above the curve, how do we create a staged return back to work? So there are kind of 3 pretty straightforward decisions, lots of data around those decisions, but once we had those variables and levers in place, we could start to build some kind of simulated approach, right? And when we started to look at it, I interviewed over 40 experts, very fortunate here at Duke to have a lot of people who know a whole lot about this, not just from the economic perspective, but from the epidemiological perspective. And general consensus was wherever in the world you are, there's going to be 4 first order decisions that are being made and have being made and continue to be made. The first is who gets the money? Who do we give money to? How much do we allocate to health? How much do we allocate to pandemic preparedness? How much do we allocate to the vaccine? How much do we allocate to individuals? How much do we allocate to small business? How much do we allocate to big companies, right? The second is who gets the equipment? How do we actually allocate access to this equipment so that we can raise the line? The third is how much do we allocate to testing and who gets the testing? And the fourth is what should be our tracing and isolation regime? Now, this will vary very widely across the world. Antonio said I lived in Singapore. Singapore's had a very, very different response in how they deal with answering these questions than the United States, than China, than Brussels, you know, and so on and so forth. But those same questions are being answered in different ways for different reasons in different regions. Now, the thing that's important to understand about that is how those questions are answered and how those resources are allocated pull forward a number of what I'm calling second order effects. Second order effects are once these things are locked down and once those decisions are made, you've created a projection path that could either lead to a nice positive outcome for health, economy, and society, or to a negative set of outcomes for health, economy, and society. And how we go from the first order decisions and these pathways that are locked in to dealing with the second order effects and how they emerge and converge and create contexts that we have to solve, that's going to determine how we succeed individually in certain regions and at a global scale. And so this is kind of the framing of the challenge that I put in front of my students to solve. Okay, any whoa-ahas or hums? I'm not seeing any, but I should get some soon. So first order decisions, second order effects. How does this work? Well, from a strategy perspective, I know Rita did some scenario work with you before. We don't want to think from first order decisions out. We want to think from wild card back. So in strategy, we call this, you know, what's possible, what's the black swan, what's the wild card, what's plausible, meaning what might happen, what's possible, meaning it could happen, and what's preferable, what would we like to happen. A lot of times when we're planning, we kind of think from the left-hand side and we kind of project on out in terms of what we're trying to do and make the best decisions. And it's clear that every government today is trying to make the best first order decisions. What we fail to do and what we really need to do, and I know that you know this from project management, we need to do a pre-mortem on the worst possible outcome and then work our way back from that, because knowing that might allow us to think differently about the decisions we want to take. So let me take you through just one variation on this scenario, right? Let's assume that we're in a country where that country decides no foreign aid for unprepared nations. So if you look into Africa, for instance, you know, I think it's Angola has only 50 beds for the 50 ICU beds available. Poor access to liquidity for small and medium business, which means small and medium business, which is very quick to get back into the economy, get people back into the employment, that's dampened. Insufficient testing, and that's both testing for DNA, meaning do I have the disease, or a serology test, which means do I have immunity, and then inadequate tracing and isolation protocols, right? So these decisions are made that I'm not going to do any more testing. That's actually something that's been said here in the United States. That could be different in your region, but I'm just giving you one example. So once those 4 decisions kind of lock in, well, another number of things then are knock-on effects from that. A second order effect is that because we're going to be taking at least 2 years to get to a vaccine, there's going to be 2 years to 5 years, depending on who you talk to. we need to look for treatments like remdesivir in between. Well, depending on the regime, you could have unequal access to COVID treatments. Who gets the right to get them? Who decides who get them? Should frontline workers get them? Should wealthy people get them? Should actors get them? The other thing is that if we have poor access to liquidity for small and medium business, a lot of small businesses will go out of business. A lot of people will be worried about their homes and about their livelihoods. So what we get then is a mental health pandemic, and we're going to have to deal with that. And in the United States, if there's not sufficient foreign aid into the Southern Hemisphere, and we get a second wave like we did the last time with 100 years ago, you could actually see that the US election could be compromised. That people would not feel comfortable going out, and we don't have enough mail-in votes, and that could be a possible second order effect. So that second order effect now creates a whole bunch of third order effects. So if the SMB stuff doesn't work, and there's unequal access to treatment, and we haven't done that right kind of investment, we could have global unemployment reaching record levels. If we haven't continued to invest in foreign aid, and we haven't continued to invest in providing food for those most in need, you got to eat, which means you're going to get up and you're going to go out, which means you're going to further spread the virus. If the demand for oil continues to stay low and oil stays at $40, global oil prices could remain depressed, and petrostates could collapse because there's just no more revenue. And if this continues for a couple of years, this could be a significant problem. And then, of course, there will be winners and losers in industries, but what we can, I think, say with some clarity from a third order effect is multinationals are going to nearshore their supply chains, look for more resilience in them. And they're also going to increase automation because, machines don't get sick. And so that's third order effects. Let's take them out a little bit more then. So if you take those ones and they wave out into the fourth, institutional trust is undermined. If I can't get a job and I can't get my unemployment, and I can't get access to treatment and benefits, why should I trust in government? Global warming isn't stopping. We have had some days of nice clear air, but at the same time, we're going to have to deal with that. And depending on which kind of regime wants to move forward, that could be a problem. Mass migration could reach new heights because all of those other reasons coming together, you start to see more and more people wanting to move to where it's safe. And then in terms of new world order, China's Belt and Road can continue to expand. From an economic perspective, they're off to the races. They're doing pretty well and getting back on board. There's been a little bump in the road here. The U.S.'s half New Deal unravels in terms of maybe putting a new deal in place like we did previously, but it's not working economically because the small and medium businesses, which are the backbone, haven't come through. And then we could perhaps see terror regimes take over petrostates. So what I've done here is kind of move from a preferable outcome where we have good health, good society, good economy, and I've painted a pretty grim picture looking at possible plausible to see what could actually happen. And here's where I'm hoping to get some whoa-aha and hms. Here is a possible future 10 years out. Everyone ready?
Our time to avenge the hegemony of the old world order that has caused a life of suffering for our people has come. At midnight tonight, we will release a biological weapon within your regions that is as deadly as MERS and can spread as fast as measles. All of my people around the world have been vaccinated and are immune. For the rest of you, who have ruled over our people with impunity for centuries, your day of reckoning has come. 1 month from now, our people will be free of your tyranny forever.
So, why do we do this? Why do we put together a set of first, second, third order effects to think about what a possibility might be, where you say petrostates collapse, terrorist order takes over, technology like CRISPR 5 years from now makes biological terrorism a whole lot more feasible than nuclear terrorism, and oh, by the way, the idea of a virus as kind of shutting down the economy is pretty pregnant and pretty pressing in our minds today. Well, because we know from research, if we do a pre-mortem to try to understand what a possible negative likely outcome is, we might make different decisions about resource allocation now so that we can do things better together moving forward. So it's not sensationalism as much as it is, let's be clear-eyed about what a possible future is on the negative side, given that we could see these first, second, third, and fourth order effects come through, and then figure out how to manage our way through it.
Our time.
So the point I try to make here is that we're dealing with quite a complex environment. And when I say complex, I want to be clear about what I'm talking about here. If you play pool or snooker, a simple environment is you have a clear shot over the ball. A complicated environment is all your balls are covered, but you might have to do a triple bank shot. A complex environment is different because you have 15 people who are all at the snooker table who are going to take a shot at the same time. And a chaotic environment is the same as the complex environment, except we remove gravity, so everything turns upside down. And so I've done a fair amount of writing in this. So if we're in a world where outcome predictability is low, we're not exactly sure what's going to happen, and environmental certainty is low, meaning we don't know, that should say low, sorry, down here. Environmental certainty is low, meaning we don't know exactly what levers to pull and to push to get the outcome we're looking for. We can arrange these contexts in this way. Simple context is, I know exactly what's going to happen. I know exactly what I need to do to make it happen. All I have to do is execute. Chaotic context is, I have no idea what's going to happen, and I have no idea what levers to pull or push, even to move in the direction I need to go. And the reality here is that we have what I call a big chasm. There's a big chasm between simple and complicated context and a complex and chaotic context. On the left-hand side of the chasm, you are in an ordered and predictable environment. You can reduce things down into the parts. You have knowable issues and outcomes. So to navigate this is what we do as project leaders all the time. We plan and anticipate, we exchange structured information, we track progress against targets, we identify issues and develop hypotheses and solve problems. That's what we do. On the right-hand side, it's unordered, unpredictable, it's holistic and uncontrollable, and there's lots of unknowable issues and outcomes. So to navigate that environment, we actually have to operate quite differently. We have to sense, learn, and respond and see what's happening in the environment. We have to exchange unstructured information along emergent interfaces because the second, third, and fourth order effects come together. We have to track assumptions and unknowns, and we have to try and identify patterns to develop insights to discover progression paths, just like Sully did. I'm in a glider. So what I'm suggesting is we're moving into a world that is leaning more towards the right, and when a lot of what we have traditionally done to be successful is leaning into the left. And I feel that there's a very important role for those of us who understand how to lead projects on the right-hand side, but it also will require that we think differently about what it means to execute. On the left-hand side, as project leaders, there's an activity-based approach, which is you identify outcomes, contingencies, and triggers. You create the decision tree. You identify the risks. You come up with your contingencies. That's the process piece. The relationship piece is you engage experts to try to figure out what the right answer is. You increase stakeholder awareness of what you're doing, and you prepare stakeholders for consequences and contingencies. So you let them know if this trigger happens, we will respond. The derailers in a complicated world are we analyze too much. We have overconfidence and expertise. We listen to experts too much, and we discount our expert difference of opinion. So we kind of go with one expert. And these derailers, we have to really think about the data and the hypotheses that we're dealing with. We have to challenge expert opinions, and we have to require diversity of perspective. On the right-hand side, the activity approach is quite different. We have to scan for patterns, conduct progression path experiments, and we have to probe the environment to surface the patterns, and we have to identify how to move forward. So it's not as much about getting to the target, it's about understanding the direction, which means that we have to engage partners in a network with diversity of perspective. We have to protect time and space for these patterns to emerge. We can't jump to a solution too fast. So the derailers when we're dealing with a complex world as project leaders is the temptation to control the situation, to try to solve the problem, to look for facts, not patterns. And to avoid that, we have to avoid default thinking and falling into on time, on budget, and scope, engage in collective sense making, and allow time for pattern recognition and probing. So the way I think about it here is On the left-hand side, in a complicated world, we know the outcomes, we look for the triggers, we plan for contingencies, and we're living in a find-it-out world. We have to accumulate, analyze, and plan ahead of time to get the work done. On the right-hand side, it's a different kind of model where we have to look for patterns, we have to generate insights like Sully did, we have to identify progression paths, possible futures, that we then bring back over into the complicated side for an outcome we're looking for to test. And it's like an infinity loop, and we have to go back and forth. But on the right-hand side, it's a figure-it-out world. It's a world where we don't have all the answers, and we have to try and find progression paths, which means you have to engage, experiment, and respond in real time. So it struck me, I'm almost done, it struck me when I thought about the word project, and I actually went back to its roots. The noun is a collaborative enterprise that is carefully planned and designed to achieve a particular aim. That's the world that we're in. That's a find-it-out world where we kind of marshal our resources and capabilities in a known context to de-risk particular things and get them done on time and budget. And the kind of learning that goes on in that particular model is what I call productive learning. Productive learning is teaching people how to do things we already know how to do. It's focused on driving individual human conformity around best practice for known and predictable situations. And project management, a lot of that is cadence calls, rhythm, what do we know, what do we have to get done? Now, if you think about the verb project, it's to extend outward beyond something else, an estimate or forecast on the basis of trends. It's project, projecting, looking forward. If that's what a project is, then we are living in a figure-it-out world where we have to kind of tap into the intuition and insight of many people to test their awareness and diversity of perspective. And we come up with what we call generative learning, that none of us could have come up with ourselves, focused on creating collective human creativity around next practice for unknown and unpredictable situations. So my argument here is, I think project really matters. Project the noun and project the verb. And if we don't have a group of people who have the same level of passion and engagement around the right-hand side of this model, particularly as we're dealing with COVID, we're going to be in trouble. I feel that we're going to be in trouble. And again, there's a chasm between the two. So the challenge that we have, I think, as project leadership professionals is twofold. Too often, we don't adhere to Einstein's insight that says a product should be broken down, a problem should be broken down to its simplest form, but no simpler. We tend to want to oversimplify and say that the context isn't as complex as we'd like because we want to break things down. And the second error, that's a type 1 error, is we misdiagnose our context. And the second error is that even if we know the context is complex, we tend to want to respond in a way that we've always responded. And so I'll leave with a thought from Hermione Ibarra that says, people are more likely to act their way into a new way of thinking rather than think their way into a new way of acting. So this is kind of like, let's be more, let's not overthink things, let's go try and do things. So the only way to change how you think is to do different things. So I'll pause, I'll end with this question. What one thing must you do more, better, or differently as a project leader to recognize and respond to the increasing rate of change and degree of complexity we are facing post-COVID? That's it, Antonio.
Thank you, Tony. Amazing presentation. Wow. Thank you. Just so many points to reflect. Yeah, I love your slides, by the way. Such a nice looking slides. Beautiful.
That's my colleague, Gary Zemchik. I know that, I know Alex and Eve have a great partnership, and Gary has been a partner of mine since my time at IBM. And so I talk and he draws.
Okay, let me open up for some questions. I think you're painting a bit of a dark future, but I know you're an optimist too. What would be the optimist story, briefly, instead of going to the negative path or the more dark one? Is there a possibility to look at from a bright side? I'm sure you've thought about this.
I have. I think the bright side, it really does come to the other stuff that I've been doing for Brightline, which is kind of people-centered transformation. I think at the end of the day, there's not a human being on this planet who doesn't want their loved ones and everybody in the world to overcome this. So the motivation, the intrinsic motivation for us to survive and thrive as a species is there. That's good news. If that motivation wasn't there, there's a problem. But now we have to go from that motivation to overcome obfuscation, the lack of clarity about what's going on. And I think that this becomes a very tricky challenge, because those 4 core questions that we ask about how do we allocate money from an economic perspective and from a healthcare perspective, if there's high variability around the world, the virus doesn't know borders. The virus doesn't say, oh, that's Canada, I have to stop and turn left to the United States. The virus knows none of the constraints or barriers that we do. And it will find, you know, the most willing host it can in the least efficient way, in the most efficient way possible. And so unless we have at least as coordinated a response on a global scale, it's almost like the irony is that the simplicity of the virus's operating system will beat us. Now, give you an example. If, for instance, we were to use technology, and we were to use a sophisticated tracing system, and we were to use a rigorous isolation regime, we'd have a chance. The challenge with that is, I can speak perhaps for the United States, in a world, in a country that is founded in kind of fighting for liberty and kind of independence, your own independence, your own sovereign independence, the notion of the government kind of tracing your every move is one that really comes up against core value systems, right? And so now, you know, we tend to overemphasize difference, right? And I feel that this is a time where our enemy, if we want to use a warfare kind of mental model, our enemy will win if we're divided and conquered.
Yeah.
And so this becomes the challenge, Antonio. And I also feel that if we're thinking about project as projection and trying to find the best possible path, how do we marshal resources around that to ensure that we're testing all the best possible paths to move forward and learning from other places? Sweden was doing pretty well with the notion of herd immunity for a while, but the math doesn't work. The math on herd immunity doesn't work because, I mean, if you look at even at North Korea and how well they held things in, or South Korea, I'm sorry, you'd have to go through 3 or 4 or 5 cycles. You've got to get to 86% or so of the population in order to get to herd immunity. America's maybe at 6 to 10. We're not testing enough to know if we really are at 6 to 10. That's a whole nother. It's a known unknown. It's one we could take action on, but we're not. But if 6 to 10% of the population means that the economies can't run for 3 months, well, how many cycles of that can we go through? Because we have to balance lives and livelihoods.
Yeah.
So I think on the one aspect, I'm hopeful and optimistic because we all have a shared aspiration. If you want to use Roger Martin's kind of framework, that we all would like to survive. But I think once we start going down into the deeper levels of strategic inquiry or how we execute, our differences could tear us apart. And that's worrisome to me, if I'm being candid.
Yeah, and I think linked to that, Tony, for me, what worries is that what we call core values, and I think we shared a lot of core values around the world in the past. Now, many of the leaders that are ruling the world, they don't have the same core values. They're very, very different than the core values that the majority. So that's another aspect that worries me a bit, but maybe you can comment. I want to pick up a couple of questions while we do that, but who is here? There's so many points. You trigger a lot of discussions. I'm a bit lost. Maria Isabel, can you quickly come to the screen and share your question with Tony?
Hello. I do not have a screen device,
It's
but
okay.
voice. But certainly, after I have a wow, amazing presentation. My congratulations. And I have a question. Are we facing a huge paradigm that is making us to question all the things we have learned for centuries?
Mhm.
What
Yeah,
What do you think about?
I do.
Do we have to like erase everything and then start like babies of 40 days years old?
I think, Maria, this is actually quite an important question. If we look at prior paradigmatic ages, so if you think about discontinuity, disruptions that create discontinuity, that create a gap between what we knew previously and what we know now, like, you know, um, the Earth doesn't revolve, the sun doesn't revolve around the Earth. It took Galileo and some scientific empirical evidence for us to have to reframe that, and that kind of changes your perspective in a pretty big way. The Earth's not flat. The Earth, those kind of paradigmatic shifts. I do feel that we're somewhat in one of these. When Rita talks about inflection points, the basic idea is that in an from Andy Grove, right, is that kind of the rule basis on which you built your whole kind of governance model, world shifts. It's pretty clear that there's three outcomes. The first outcome is collapse, meaning that we just can't catch up fast enough. And the reason that collapse happens is because we spend too much time in something called snapback. Snapback is our human desire for things to go back to the way they were. If only I could go watch a concert. I wish I could have gone to see Liverpool. If only my kids could go to school again. So nostalgia. In fact, during the American Civil War, nostalgia was called a disease because you had people pining for the past. But that's a bit of a fallacy, because when we pine for the past, we're pining for a reality that no longer exists. So the quicker we can get out of that, the better. The problem with that is that it requires that we overcome a core set of assumptions that we have held to be true up until now, and we have to surface them, question them, and move forward. And if we can then move to big T transformation, which means we'd rewrite the kind of way that we operate to be more congruent with the reality that we're facing today. So, but the first part of that is that we are willing to let go of age-old kind of assumptions that we've held for a long time as we lean into the future. I do feel that this is a pretty big one. I think 100 years from now, when people write about this, it'll be similar to, we heard about that plague in 1918. We read a little bit about it. We're actually living through something similar today. Although I will say, again, to be optimistic, the 1918 plague took far more lives than this one will. There will most likely be a vaccine. It probably won't come as fast as many of us would want to. And it's this liminal space. The liminal space is the space between the two trapeze when you're moving from what was to what will be. And it's a dreamlike state. We're kind of stuck in this dreamlike state. And it could be a nightmare, or it could be a very happy dream. But I do feel that it depends on how we perceive the reality that we're moving towards, and how well we lead by suspending our prior assumptions and finding our new progression path as soon as we can. And I believe that, Antonio, your community, if there's any community in the world that can kind of think about that in a nuanced way, I think this is the place for that to happen.
Thank you. Nice comment. Ton, thank you for also the trust on this community. At least we're trying to find ways, which is, like you said, is trying to project and work different alternatives for a better future, but it's not an easy one.
Antonio, I mean, you've got all this in your book. I mean, if you think about the great leaders who have led great Mandela led a great project, right? I don't think that there's not a precedent for this. I just think that it's pressing.
Exactly. exactly. Is there any last question here? Well, the feedback is brilliant, Tony. Lots of comments, lots of wows, lots of aha, which is, I think, great to see. I don't know, who wants to say some last question? Anybody want to finish on time?
I wanted to, Antonio.
Yeah.
I wanted to add something that it's my takeaway from this presentation. I learned from a great philosopher, Kirpal Singh, that he said that our main purpose in this life is to know ourselves. And I was wondering if this situation of the COVID, okay, and after watching this wonderful presentation, I'm getting hooked to that idea that the reason it's we need to know ourselves in order to continue moving forward. And the technology that we have tends to make us divorce from ourselves. And then we are confronting a huge situation, or like a duality between getting hooked to the external of us or getting hooked to the internal of us. This is my takeaway, and I wanted to share this with all of you.
I think that's right. I think that when there are disruptions and discontinuities, there are two forms. One is accelerative, which means that the things we thought were going to happen faster. There'll be less retail stores in the future than in the past. There may be less airline travel. There are things that we saw happening, but now COVID has maybe accelerated them 5 to 10 years. So that's accelerative change. The other is paradigmatic, which means up until this happened, we couldn't have imagined that future because the set of conditions on the ground wasn't what it is today. And I think a lot of times we tend to want to solve for the accelerative ones and we ignore the paradigmatic. And I think in a way, we almost have to go into our inside and our core purpose as a species and as a people, writ large, and then find the paradigm we want, and then move back to taking advantage of the accelerative trends to get us to the future we desire. So I do think that there's a little bit of outside in and inside out, and I feel that we're largely perhaps missing the more paradigmatic shift that's underway because we're busy dealing with the accelerative ones. Oh, let's hurry up and inshore supply chains. Let's digitize more of this. Let's reinvent the university so that we can have more access. All of those are positive, but perhaps insufficient.
Thank you very much. There were a few questions, but we need to finish here. Sorry if I cannot put you on the mic, but it was a really inspirational talk. Tony, thank you for spending a bit of time with us. We'll refer to you, to your connection, and people, if they want to reach out, I suppose they can reach out through LinkedIn, I guess it's easy. Your book, when is your book coming out?
Oh, not for a while, Antonio. We've just, well, hopefully, I think we're signing at the end of this week. So
okay,
it'll be a little while. Yeah.
That's good news. So for next year.
And thank you. I appreciate you're the reason for that. So thanks for that.
You're
Antonio.
welcome, always. So that's all. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Tony. Thank you for being here. We'll share the presentation, if that's okay with you, and your contact.
Yes, I'll send it to you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then
sure.
to everybody,
I'll send it right along.
Thank you for being here, and I'll see you latest next Thursday. We have another great speaker, Alexander Levitt, also from the Thinkers 50. So take care, keep safe. Thank you, Tony, again. Many IBMers on the call, big fans, great people always.
Okay. Take care, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Gracias.
Thank you for arranging.
All the best.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, Tony. I am your fan.